This is Cory Trowbridge. Cory's lifelong interest in reptiles and amphibians has led him to a career in the conservation and ecology of at-risk species. As project biologist for the, I'm going to say this wrong, I'm sorry, Ojibwe Prairie Reptile Recovery Program. Hopefully I've said it right. At Wildlife Preservation Canada, he oversees the recovery of the Butler's garter snake. His past research has focused on the ecology of reptiles and amphibians around energy facilities. So Cory has worked with various reptile and amphibian species across Ontario, and I'm going to hand you over to him now.
Hi, and thanks for joining me. My name is Cory Trowbridge. I'm a project biologist for Wildlife Preservation Canada, but today I'm going to be presenting work on what I did as part of my master's thesis, specifically on a paper we published in Herpetologica earlier this year on how wind farms alter amphibian community diversity and coursing behavior. So before I start, I would like to make some acknowledgements to those that were involved or helped in this project. First off, Evulgen, an energy producer that allowed us to conduct this research on their wind farm, as well as Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, or NSERC, for funding, and the volunteers who helped with the field work along the way as well. And I want to thank these individual people as well. My thesis supervisor, Dr. Jacqueline Litskis, the committee members to my thesis, Kelly Withers and Dr. Nathan Basilico, as well as our field tech for both years, Vanessa. So wind energy industry is expanding across the globe as the demand for green energy alternatives increases to reduce fossil fuel use. While there's a great benefit in switching to renewable green energy for reduced emissions, there are concerns for wildlife within some of these facilities. Over the past 2 decades, there have been many studies on wind turbine impacts, most of them concerning birds and bats, and most of those studies concerning with fatalities of collisions with turbines. However, there are also some studies on the avoidance of turbines, especially during bird migrations. More recently, though, these concerns have started to shift towards reptiles, starting with studies on desert tortoises, where they found no differences in tortoise movements, but these tortoises were being seen as being at risk because they utilize the roadside habitats within the wind farms. Differences have also been noticed in other lizards due to possible lack of predators, causing differences in anti-predator behaviors, and even causing larger populations, resulting in higher competition and reduced fitness for individuals within these populations. However, there still remains a large gap in knowledge around wind farm impacts on both reptiles and amphibians. For example, there still is a lack of knowledge about turtles, especially semi-aquatic turtles in wetlands near wind turbines or wind farms. As well, to the best of our knowledge at the time when we were doing this study, there was no published studies on amphibians of any kind within wind farms. And these two things were the main purpose of my master's thesis, to help fill this gap in knowledge about the effects of wind farm proximity and operation on reptile and amphibian ecology and behavior. Today, specifically, I'll be talking about the second chapter of my thesis on amphibian community ecology and anuran acoustics in a wind farm. I want to start by restating that there is a gap in knowledge around amphibians in wind farms. To the best of my knowledge, there are no other studies on amphibians in wind farms at the time of when we were doing this study. And this is concerning because amphibians are declining across the globe. We're taking away their habitats, we're introducing pollution and diseases to them, and we're also making other disturbances such as noise pollution, which is greatly affecting these populations. Now, you might be wondering, what is noise pollution? Well, noise pollution is as simple as it sounds. It's human-created noise that we introduce to the environment in our everyday activities, such as through city life, driving our cars, or possibly even making wind farms. Amphibians, specifically frogs, perceive this noise pollution and it affects how they call. They adjust their calls to compete with the introduced noise, and they do this by calling at higher pitches with shorter durations. And this has been actually seen to occur near roads quite frequently. At the time, there are no studies on frogs around turbine noise or wind farm noise, but there were some studies on birds calling near turbine noise, where some birds appeared to be unaffected by the turbine or wind farm noise. Some lower frequency or lower pitch calling birds adjusted their calls around this wind farm and wind turbine noise. As there are no studies on amphibians around wind farms at the time, this was a big goal of our research, to investigate the amphibians around wind farms for community ecology differences and frog call differences. Now, frog call differences matter and are important because frogs use their calls for reproduction. And if these frogs are changing their calls, their reproductive success could possibly be altered, which could lead to altered reproductive fitness. So our hypothesis for this project was, if amphibians are negatively affected by turbine noise or wind farm noise, then amphibian populations and anuran courses within wind farms will show lower richness in species diversity, and calls will be shorter and higher pitched. So we conducted this research in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, in Prince Wind, through a cooperation with Avulsion and an NSERC Engage grant. Now, Prince Wind is a 189 megawatt wind farm with 126 turbines stretched across northern Ontario forests, and it's been operating since around 2006. We conducted this research in the spring and summer of 2018 and 2019 using 8 study sites in 2 treatments. Control sites over 1.5 kilometers from a wind farm or wind turbines, and turbine sites located within 500 meters of a wind turbine. Now, all of these sites we used were as similar as possible as we could, with wetlands and adjoining forests. However, as majority of the area is private lands, site selection was still limited to private owners willing to give access to their lands. So I looked at the acoustic differences by using 2 wildlife acoustic song meters rotating through 4 control sites and 4 turbine sites to do nightly paired recordings of frog calls from May to July of 2018 and 2019. I then used the acoustic software Kaleidoscope Pro and its cluster analysis to separate out frog choruses in order to get estimated abundances of frog calls, to determine chorus richness and evenness, and analyze individual call properties that we'll get into a little bit more detail later. I also used transect surveys of these sites through May to September of both of the years, conducting 2 surveys of a random site each day, once in the morning and once in the evening, noting all amphibians found on the transects and recording air, ground temperatures, as well as GPS coordinates of observation. I then looked at the cumulative diversity and evenness of amphibians found in each site and the Menhinnick's richness of each individual survey. So Menhinnick's richness is a species richness index on a log scale. It accounts for the abundance of individuals as well as the species richness. So in this equation here, the S is the number of species encountered during a survey, and the N is the total number of individuals across all species found during the survey. So jumping right into the results here, no dilly-dallying. Transect surveys revealed no differences in cumulative species diversity or evenness between treatments via student t-test. So when looking at all amphibians on transects, there were no differences in the diversity between control sites and wind farm sites. However, as there was a lot of surveys where no animals were found, the richness data was zero inflated. So this means that there is a lot of zeros in the data. So we analyzed this using a gamma hurdle model, which is a 2-model analysis with a model on a gamma distribution that looks at when zeros are not present, and a binomial model that looks at just the 0 and non-zero data as ones and zeros. So was an animal found or not? In easier terms, we made 2 models to evaluate the surveys, one for when an amphibian was found versus when none was found, and another model looking at only when amphibians were found and the richness of it. So the non-zero model, the one for when animals were found only individual sites, regardless of treatment and Julian date, as significant predictors of richness. But the binomial model, the one for if we found an animal or not, found that treatment, site, and Julian date were significant predictors. So, in other words, we see that control and wind farm treatments did not differ in manganic richness when amphibians were found. However, the frequency of finding at least one individual during a transect survey was higher in turbine sites or wind farm sites than control sites. So based on transect surveys, there appears to be little impact of the wind farm on amphibians. And it appears that the chances of finding individuals is actually higher in the turbine sites, which could indicate maybe a higher abundance, or maybe the animals are harder or easier to find, which is quite interesting. However, when we look at the acoustic data of the frog calls, we actually see a different story. So looking at the diversity of the acoustic recordings with a mixed linear effects model, we see that treatment and date were significant predictors of chorus diversity and evenness. So we actually see a lower chorus diversity and evenness in turbine sites compared to control sites. So during this time, we recorded a total of 6 species of frogs calling between all sites. However, only half of these species were recorded calling in the wind farm. Only gray tree frogs and American bullfrogs were only recorded in control sites. And also the wood frogs were not recorded within the wind farms. However, they were found during the transect surveys, so we just didn't get recordings of them calling. But bullfrogs and tree frogs were not found during these surveys. Granted, tree frogs can be very difficult to find during just normal surveys, not looking for acoustics. But bullfrogs, on the other hand, we didn't find them at all. We didn't find them in the water, even when we were doing turtle tracking as part of my other chapter. So this difference in species diversity is supported by there being half the number of species calling within the wind farm. But why would these frogs not be calling? To attempt to answer this, we took a closer look at 2 calls of frog species that were found calling in both treatments, in both control and wind farm: green frogs and spring peepers. For fun, I'm going to play a call of the green frog so you can hear what they sound like. They have a distinctive grunt there that can vary quite a bit, and it can also be strung into a series of grunts. For frog calls, they're actually not too loud or too harsh to listen to. There are also some spring peepers in the background if you listen closely. Kind of that peep in the background there. I'm not going to play them like spring peeper calls individually, just to save the eardrums of all headphone wearers. Their calls are essentially a single peep or tone, but it's very high pitched and it's very loud. It can be as loud as a lawnmower or a concert at 90 decibels. And their choruses from a distance, to me, sound like spring, but when you get up close, they can be quite overwhelming and quite loud, as they all kind of string together and they all call on top of each other, and it can be very, very loud. So of these calls, I looked at 3 characteristics: the mean frequency, the minimum frequency, as well as the duration of these calls. So I did this by using the Kaleidoscope program to separate out the individual calls using the data recorded by the program for each of these calls, after manually verifying that all the calls that I was using were correctly identified and of good quality for this analysis. So the results of analyzing the call characteristics of green frogs using a linear mixed effects model, I found that calls in the wind farm did not differ from calls in control sites for any of the 3 characteristics. However, they did differ among sites, which is where these results start to get interesting. I predicted that the calls in the wind farm would be shorter and higher pitched, meaning that frogs in control sites should have longer, lower pitched calls. So these figures I have here, which are a line and a dot, are organized in from largest means to smaller means, and the means are the dots. So when we highlight calls with lower mean and max frequency and longer calls, we see that C1 and C4, which are control site 1 and control site 4, tend to group together and share what we predicted of these control sites. They're lower frequency and longer. However, when we look at the turbine sites, we see that they're typically higher frequency and shorter in length. And we also see the other two control sites, C3 and C2 in the red boxes, kind of grouping together with them as well in terms of frequency. There's one difference between control sites C4 and C1, or the yellow boxes, and the other two control sites in the red boxes. The yellow sites are located far from any roads. They're actually rather remote compared to the red sites, which were actually located quite close to roads. Initially, we assumed that the low traffic volume on these roads wouldn't be loud enough to cause these green frogs to adjust their calls to the road noise, but it appears that they might actually be doing that. And it's something that's well documented in the literature, so it's not too much of a surprise, but it is a surprise for our work. And as these sites are often grouping with the turbine sites, we actually see that the frogs in the turbine sites or the wind farm sites might be calling similar to those near roads. So just to summarize those results, green frogs call characteristics did not differ between treatments, but were predicted by temperature, date, and site. And when looking closer at sites, we see that frogs near roads are calling similar to frogs within the wind farm. Although it should be strongly noted here, these results are not supported with a clear statistical significant test. But we do see this trend happening. When we consider that these frogs call at a low frequency and that the noise they're calling around, the wind farm noise and the road noise, is also low frequency, the green frogs are possibly competing with the noise in the environment. And this lack of difference between treatments could also be due to having road noise within half the control sites. I also want to make a note here as we're talking about low frequency calling frogs. Bullfrogs are also a low frequency caller, similar to green frogs. And I'll play their low burr call so you can hear what they sound like. They would also need to compete with this wind farm noise possibly. And however, they don't appear to be within the wind farm during our transect surveys or our recordings. If they're unable to compete with the turbine or wind farm noise, then that might be an explanation of why they're absent. But what about species that call at a higher frequency than what the wind farm noise might be having, or the road noise might be having, such as spring peepers? Well, again, we didn't find difference in call characteristics between control and turbine treatments, but characteristics again differed among sites. However, unlike the green frogs, when we look at these control sites again, we do still see that the two far from road sites, C4 and C1, pairing together, but we don't see the clear separation of these sites always being lower pitched or longer than the turbine sites or wind farm sites, or the other control sites that were located near roads. So this suggests that the spring peepers are not adjusting their calls to either the road noise or the wind farm noise, or at least not to the same extent as the green frogs. And this would make sense because they call at a higher frequency than what the noise in their environment is around them, as they would not need to compete with it. So to recap this, our transects found that richness and diversity was similar in both control and turbine sites, but the frequency of finding something during a survey was higher in the wind farm. However, only 3 out of 6 frog species recorded were calling in turbine sites, resulting in a lower chorus diversity and evenness in turbine sites or a wind farm site. Spring peepers and green frogs have similar call characteristics in the wind farm compared to control sites. However, this might be confounded or masked by road noise in the control sites. And it appears that frogs in turbine sites or wind farm sites call similar to frogs in control sites near roads. So this suggests that if amphibians are impacted by wind farms, it is on the calling environment for the frogs. If these frogs are adjusting their calls to compete with turbine noise or wind farm noise, they could face fitness costs if the altered calls are requiring more energy to perform, or if they're not as successful at attracting mates. So my thesis also found that amphibian diversity did not differ between control and wind farm sites on transect surveys. Frog choruses in the wind farm had fewer species than choruses outside the wind farm, suggesting a difference in calling environment. This difference in calling environment could be caused by a response to noise within the wind farm. Although not supported statistically, there is a trend of frogs near roads and within the wind farm to call similarly, with higher pitched and shorter calls. If these frogs are adjusting their calls to compete with wind farm and wind turbine noise, they could face fitness costs if altered calls require more energy to perform, or if they're not successful at attracting mates. For example, we can look at the bullfrogs in a hypothetical scenario. Hypothetically, if bullfrogs were unable to compete with this wind farm noise, they may be unable to attract mates, or they're spending too much energy altering their calls in order to compete with this anthropogenic wind farm noise to make calling a viable method to try to attract mates. So perhaps they're not present because they can't attract mates within these wetlands. Although my results don't fully support all my hypotheses, the purpose of my research is still being met in some way. We filled some knowledge gaps and identified directions for future research. Now, what should this future research be? Well, first off, like all science experiments, this study needs to be redone again and done in different areas to see if these trends are happening elsewhere and are consistent. Luckily, I know that the Litskis lab at Laurentian University currently has a graduate student repeating this study in a different Ontario wind farm. So hopefully we'll hear some results from their project in the future. Future studies should also include an in-depth research on frog calls in the wind farms by using playbacks of audio recordings. So this is done by recording a sound of interest, such as the wind farm noise or the wind turbine noise, and then playing it back to the frogs to see if they adjust their calls. And also, they should also look at seeing if frogs naive to the wind farm noise react in the same way as those experienced with the noise. Or these playback recordings could also be look at females to see if females are as attracted to calls that are being altered within the wind farm as calls that are unaltered outside the wind farm, and to see if they're just as successful. This would show us whether or not there's a possible fitness cost of calling within the wind farm. Now, I want to end by saying the push for green energy is very important. If we ever want to move away from fossil fuels, we need to push more for green energy. But the development for green energy alternatives should be, although the development for green energy alternatives should be encouraged, but this development needs to be green for ecosystems as well as emissions. In order for us to ensure that, we need to encourage more research in these green energy facilities and wind farms, and even solar farms as well. I also, again, want to end by thanking all those mentioned in the acknowledgements in the beginning, and also thank you for watching. I will be here for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cory. That was wonderful. There's lots of comments going up in the chat saying great research and things like that. So I hope you can keep an eye on that. You've got lots of questions. Once again, it's a wonderful study that you've done. But I'll get straight on to the questions straight away. One is, did you use active or passive sound recorders? I mean, I assume you used passive sound recorders, but did you do active sound recorders as well?
No, we mostly only use the passive sound recorders. We attempted to do some active recording. It just didn't quite work out for us. We had some stipulations with the wind farm. You know, we can't be in there too late at night. It's a safety concern and that. So it became a little difficult to do active recordings.
Yeah, I completely understand. I completely understand. Wind is noisy. Someone's put in. Turbines would be put in windy spots. Were control sites in locations with similar wind conditions?
Yeah, so our control sites were located really close to our wind farm as well. Like, so I tried to keep it as close to the just over 1.5 kilometers from a wind turbine. That way we know that we're within a similar habitat and a similar environment, and all the conditions are as similar as we could get.
Excellent. So you're nailing these questions quickly as well. You've got a lot of them. Did you record reproductive success? And what about excess predation due to noise?
I wish we were able to do the reproductive success. I was a little limited. I did stretch myself quite thin when doing these studies. Like I did these frog recordings in the evening and the mornings, but during the day I was out tromping around through the water, actually tracking turtles. So it kind of took some, did what we could where we could. And like if in the future, I would say, yeah, reproductive success should be looked at too, especially if you're seeing differences between populations, between control and treatment and outside of the wind farm.
I mean, your sort of study is kind of evolution in action, isn't it, really? So if something's altering its behavior just because of anthropogenic noise, it's kind of quite an interesting just an interesting behavior, full stop. So I was putting, sorry if I missed it, but what was the timing of the survey work relative to when the turbines were constructed? I think this links onto another question as well. Was there any chance of doing things before the turbines were operational and after they were operational?
No, unfortunately, this was all done after the turbines were put up. So there was quite a few years afterwards. So there is possibility that some species might have moved back or might have disappeared since. I know that I was browsing through the questions, so I can answer another question that popped up because it kind of works out. We were able to compare with the environmental assessment before the wind farm went in. So we were able to compare the species that they found before the wind farm went in versus what we found. And there were some frogs that we found that they didn't find, and frogs that they found that we didn't find in the wind farm. So bullfrogs, for example, I believe they were found there, but they weren't found after. But there are other species that the assessment didn't find, but we were kind of confused at why they didn't find them. So not frog related, but red-spotted newts were not found in any of their sites. But when we went in and when we were tracking turtles, we had to watch our step because we had to watch out from stepping on them. So it's kind of it's a hard comparison to make.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. Oh, what was the size of the wind turbines, and how was the control distance of 1.5 kilometers determined, or above 1.5 kilometers?
Yeah, so the size of the wind turbines, I think they were 1.5 megawatt turbines or something. I can't remember quite off the top of my head what the size were, but they are smaller turbines relative to the wind farms that are going up now. They were much smaller. So the student I mentioned that's currently doing a repeat of this study, their turbines are like twice the size. They're massive. So they were smaller turbines. The 1.5 stemmed from, I did a fourth year thesis on basically the same topic, but in a different area. And we used within 1.5 kilometers of a wind turbine, and we found anything like over a kilometer, we just didn't find any difference at all. They're about pretty much all the same. So we kind of gauged that as like, let's get as close as possible. The issue is also that there are some regulations on how close wind turbines can get to wetlands and that. So our best bet was to try to, get as close as we could for turbine sites, and then as far as we could while staying within the same habitat and same environmental conditions as we could. So that's sort of what stemmed the 1.5 kilometers from turbines.
I mean, this is because I'm a host, I can ask a question. But on the actual turbine sites themselves, on your recordings, could you hear the turbines?
Oh yeah, you could hear the turbines. I was trying to find a good picture that showed a frog call and the turbine noise in there. It gets a little difficult. They're not super loud, but you can hear them, and you can see them in the spectrograms when you're looking at them.
So that brings me on to another cheeky question. But was there, well, is this a possible study? Maybe, on the times when the turbines maybe not turning because there's no wind for that day or whatever. So you're not picking up any recordings. Do the frogs go back to their original call pattern, or do they maintain this new call pattern?
That would be a great thing to look at. We unfortunately weren't able to get the data of when turbines were spinning and when they weren't, when they turned them on and turned them off. The wind farm just didn't really give us the data. Whereas this actually news, I'm putting him on the spot. He's in watching this, but it seems like they're going to give them the data of when turbines start and stop. So they might actually be able to do that comparison too.
Cool. Well, I've got one more question, and please feel there's loads more just coming through the chat. But and I think this is one that people that are dealing with wind turbines will love an opinion on, but I'm not going to force you into something. If noise does affect amphibian calling, how would one mitigate this during the operation of a wind farm? What is the appropriate distance of a turbine from a potential breeding spot?
That's a good question. I actually get that quite often, so it's not too much of a scare. So if they do, like if it turns out that wind farms do affect frog call noises, the first step is to see what the extent of the effect on the frog populations are. So around road noises and that, my understanding for a lot of species is that, yeah, they adjust their calls, but not all species are affected by that adjusting the call. They get used to it and it just doesn't affect their populations. So if that was the case around the wind farm for specific species or the species in the area, it would be very likely that you wouldn't really have to adjust your wind farms that much for them. But if we are seeing population differences and fitness differences because of it, then you sort of have to do studies to find out what the distance between where the frog is actually perceiving the noise and not perceiving the noise. So it could be 1.5 kilometers, it could be more, it could be less. It really depends on what the data is saying. So it's difficult to say from our study, but I don't want to advertise let's get rid of wind turbines because it's making the frogs sing differently. All I want to say is just like, we need to make sure that when we're putting these wind turbines in, that we're accounting for all the species. We got really zeroed in on birds when they first went up and bats when they first went up. But now we need to kind of shift that adjustment and start looking at other species as well. And frogs, like birds, are perceiving noise and wind turbines make noise. We can't dismiss that wind turbines make noise. So we need to see how they perceive it.
So a frog by frog and habitat by habitat basis. And
yeah,
so lots of you go out and do studies now on wind turbines and amphibians, please. Thank you.
Yeah,
Corey, that's wonderful. If you're available to answer some more in the chat, then please do. That'd be brilliant. But yeah, big round of applause. I'm sure people are doing that all over the globe. And thanks for an amazing presentation. So
I'll try to answer as many questions in the chat as I can. I believe my email is on the beginning of that presentation. So if you guys want to ask questions later and need to look back and find my email, go ahead and look it up and send me an email.